Okay, hello everybody. This is Psych 3280, week 6, Neural-based consciousness. And this week we finally come to the core topic of the Christoph Koch's book, Quest for Consciousness, Neural Correlates of Consciousness. Before getting started for the week 6, let's recap the week 5. So first, we talked about the argument in support for color vision at the periphery. And there I presented several evidence. One of that is a brief presentation, which doesn't allow the eye movement, still induces vivid color sensation in the periphery. So, we can remove eye movement artifacts, like remembering or expecting what you have seen before with the phobia is filled in at the periphery at any moment. Okay, and then the second evidence was that the neurons at the high eccentricity have a bigger receptive fields, so that it can collect the color-related information effectively if the presented stimulus is uniform texture. And then the convergence effects, the higher level neurons are receiving a bigger extent of the neuronal input from lower visual areas, accumulates over the hierarchy. So at the B1, B1 can get the input from the retinal ganglion cells that cover multiple retinal ganglion cells. And then B2 or B4 neurons can even further combine the B1 neurons, which has a different location of the receptive fields, so that in the end, the higher the hierarchy a neuron lives in, it has a chance to accumulate information across over the wider areas. And therefore, uniform surface can potentially generate a strong activity in the peripheral neurons that have a bigger receptive field. And so I argue that the uniform colored surface can be optimum stimulus for such receptive fields. And this relates to the fact that, for example, when you go outside and then see the blue sky at the periphery, the blue can be quite vivid. It's if it's a very uniform blue. All right. On the other hand, I also presented argument against for the color vision at the periphery. And one is that the cone density, it's not the number, density, number per given areas of the retina degrades, decreases rapidly of the phobia. And in V1, the phobia is overrepresented at the expense of the periphery. So even though the peripheral neurons can have a potentially bigger, receptive field, the number of the neurons and also the dedicated amount of the resource for the periphery is in fact very, very small. And this fact, called the cortical magnification, implies that the per vision at the periphery. But this is something that not so many people realize, but this cortical magnification factor in the visual cortex is uniform across all the properties of the vision. So not only the color, but also the visual motion and also texture, as well as recognition of the object, all gets affected by this cortical magnification factor at the periphery. Okay. Next, and then we also went over the neural mechanism underlying blindsight. And 90% of visual inputs from the retina goes through the lateral geniculate nucleus, LGN, to primary visual cortex, B1. And the rest of that also has, there are 8 more other pathways, but mainly goes to the superior colliculus, and the pulvinar to the cortex. And this imposes some kind of shortcuts and multiple pathways to from the eyes to the cortex. And the important thing is that the latter pathway, superior colliculus and the pulvinar pathway, can mediate eye movements and also localization in a non-conscious manner, the one that's observed in blindsight patient. Okay. And then along the way, to explain this peripheral vision, color vision, and also blind sight mechanism, we encountered several important concepts and features of the neurons in the visual system. And that's going to be, again, reviewed in this week, but briefly, receptive fields and visual hierarchy. So the receptive field properties became more complicated, such as at the level of the retinal ganglion cells and the LGN, it's usually on-center or off-center, and on-set response or offset response. So it's pretty much like, 4 types of the responses can cover quite a bit of the description of the retinal ganglion cells and the LGN. However, as you go to B1, this becomes not possible, and there are classes of the neuron that responds to oriented lines, and the different also direction of the motion also evokes a slightly different direction the activity, and there are also neurons that are sensitive to the color and wavelengths and things like that. So it becomes more and more complicated, even from a retina to B1. And also the size of the receptive field, as I mentioned as a sort of the convergence rule, tends to become bigger as you go in the higher hierarchy. So V1 neurons have a bigger receptive field than the retinal ganglion cells or LGN. And also, but temporal latency wise, it doesn't necessarily mean that the receptive field, the neurons at the higher visual hierarchy responds later than the lower hierarchy neurons. So some of the V1 neurons can respond actually later than the neurons in the prefrontal cortex. And we are going to cover some of these interesting neurons in the later lectures. Okay. And that also relates to sort of the relationship between the feed-forward pathway and the feedback, and how come the things that comes later, such as backward masking situation, erase the conscious perception of the things that came before. So that's the temporal hierarchy of the brain. And then also each of the visual cortex, not only visual cortex, but across all the cortical areas, have an horizontally speaking columnar organization. So the receptive field properties change gradually and sometimes abruptly with a flip of the left to right, ocular dominance or direction preference and so on. There is some kind of columnar organization. Within vertical dimension, as you go from a top layer to the lower layer, usually neurons property, receptive field property changes gradually. And however, across the layers, what is different is that the connectivity pattern to and from other areas of the brain, as well as within the area of the brain. And this layer structure is, in fact, the driving factor to for the Feldman and Van Nessen to derive this hierarchical map of the brain. Okay, so these are the important concepts of the visual system. And then multiple visual pathways to explain visual, blind sight and other phenomena. Okay, so this week we will address the question of what is the link between neurons and phenomenology. What is the role of the V1 for conscious vision? So towards the end of the last week, I mentioned that all of these V1 topological features doesn't seem to match with what we perceive consciously. But this becomes really problematic if the V1 is actually responsible for conscious vision. If not, it doesn't matter so much. And then we also talk about the property of the visual cortex beyond the V1 for the rest of the lecture. Okay, so in terms of learning objectives of this week, you're going to be able to answer that what is the neural correlates of consciousness, NCC. So that's the concept needs to be clear. And then what are the positive and the negative evidence for V1 as the NCC? And then what are the properties of the neurons in the higher visual areas? And then, so these are the three main learning objectives of this week. And I put chapters 5, 6, 7, 8 as an reference chapter. And also, I also put Chris Frith's Trends in Cognitive Science paper as an optional reference. The reason becomes clearer as we go in the first part of the lecture this week, but it contains quite a useful framework for NCC search and the empirical oriented question for consciousness study. So if you want to use that for your final assessment, for the project presentation, that would be a very useful kind of paper to read. Okay, so let's get started. In week 5, we encountered this figure of the symptoms and how I explained how it gets projected into the V1. It's flipped upside down on the left and right, and then also phobia gets magnified like this way. And then this raised the following fundamental questions, such as, why do we not see images upside down? And why do we not see the image in a distorted way? What is the relationship between the outside world, our experience, and the neurons in the brain? This may sound stupid kind of questions that you may reject outright, but it's not really trivial to say why, to give a sort of a convincing explanation about all of them. In fact, if you think about animals or other types of creatures, such as computer program, especially the robots, they can actually operate completely all these images projected, especially if you plug in some kind of cable to V1 like areas for the computer or robots, and then project it back to the screen as sort of the putative their conscious experience. It's totally plausible that the robot or other creature sees the world like this way, upside down and distorted, and then really weird kind of relationship between the outside world and its experience and the processing neuronal kind of architecture. As long as the other behavioral or report kind of mechanisms are consistent with all these topology, or the relationship between the neighborhood of visibility and outside world and also representation. In fact, we can prove that there is no mathematical reason why this is not the case. So, just if this is a very difficult kind of argument, you can just imagine and say that this is not a trivial kind of question, because in fact we can imagine the robot that works like this way, and that's enough for now. Okay, and in fact all of these kind of consideration made this question about consciousness very difficult, and notoriously difficult to the extent that some of the philosophers thought that this is a hard problem that it's impossible to tackle with the scientific questions. And on the other hand, leaving aside these kind of super fundamental questions, since 1990, I also mentioned in the week 1 lecture that an empirical scientific research program started. And that's the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. And this is primarily driven by my previous PhD supervisor, Christoph Koch, and previous Nobel laureate, Francis Crick. But what they basically asked was, rather than going into the kind of very difficult philosophical questions, they posed the following more tangible kind of question. So it seems, and they said that it seems probable, however, that at any one moment, some active neuronal processes correlate with consciousness, while others do not. And you can imagine that others would include prefrontal cortex or cerebellum from the lectures a few weeks back. And they say also that what are the difference between them? Them meaning that those neurons that correlate with the consciousness and those do not. Where in the brain are the neural correlates of consciousness? That's a more concrete question. And the correlates are much easier to deal with by science. And that's the one that we are going to focus this week. Causal relationship from one event to the other, that's much more difficult to deal with. And also the philosophers also deal with or are interested in the question such as what is the relationship, causal relationship between the mental to the matter. Something like this is very, very difficult questions, but as long as you confine yourself into the level of the correlation, then you can make always empirical progress. Okay.